The ballroom at Ashbourne House glittered beneath 100 crystal flames, each chandelier scattering gold across polished marble and silk. Outside, December rain silvered the windows, while carriages crowded the square and delivered London's finest families into an evening designed for admiration, alliances, and whispered cruelty. No one had come expecting mercy. Yet before the first dance was finished, an entire room would witness a marriage being humiliated without a single raised voice. Duke Julian Ashbourne entered at 9:30. He was 34, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, and composed with the severe elegance of a man trained from childhood never to reveal uncertainty. His black evening coat fitted him like armor, its silver buttons catching the candlelight whenever he moved. An ivory cravat framed a face handsome enough to command attention, though tonight his grey-blue eyes held a guarded determination. Upon his arm rested Lady Celeste Vane. She was everything society adored, golden-haired, dazzling, confident, and dressed in champagne silk embroidered with seed pearls. Diamonds trembled at her ears and throat. Her smile carried the calm assurance of someone who believed the world had already agreed with her. The whispers began before Julian reached the center of the room. "Is that?" "Surely not." "Where is the Duchess?" The answer arrived through the great doors. Eleanor Ashbourne stepped inside alone. She was 27, slender and graceful, with an oval face, soft brown eyes, and chestnut hair gathered into an intricate chignon threaded with tiny pearls. Her gown was modest beside Celeste's splendor, a muted champagne creation of silk and lace that caught the light only when she moved. A single strand of pearls rested at her throat. Nothing about her demanded attention. And yet every eye turned toward her. Eleanor stopped. For one suspended heartbeat, she looked at her husband. Julian did not move toward her. Instead, he tightened his hand around Celeste's arm. The orchestra continued playing, though several musicians had begun exchanging uneasy glances. Eleanor heard the music as though from a distant room. She saw the familiar face of the man she had married 3 years earlier, the man whose silence had once made her ache more than anger ever could. Julian stepped forward. "Your Grace," he said, his voice carrying easily through the ballroom, "allow me to present Lady Celeste Vane." A pause. Then came the sentence that would become legend in London drawing rooms. "From this evening forward, she shall be regarded as the Duchess of Ashbourne." The violinist missed a note. Someone gasped. A wineglass slipped from a gentleman's hand and shattered against the marble. Eleanor felt no heat rise to her cheeks. That frightened her more than humiliation would have. She had imagined betrayal in 100 forms, but never this one. Her husband stripping her of her place before half of London and offering it to another woman as though a marriage were merely an inconvenient ribbon that could be untied. Celeste turned toward her. For the first time, uncertainty flickered beneath the blonde woman's polished expression. Perhaps she had expected tears. Perhaps she had expected fury. Eleanor gave her neither. She gathered the folds of her gown with both hands, walked across the ballroom, and stopped before Celeste. The chandeliers burned overhead. Hundreds of faces watched. Then Eleanor lowered herself into a perfect curtsy. Not hurried. Not trembling. Impeccable. "Your Grace," she said softly. The words struck the room harder than a scream. A murmur rolled through the guests, changing in character as it traveled. Some whispered that Eleanor had surrendered. Others saw something colder in her composure. Lady Beatrice Harrow, an elderly countess near the fireplace, leaned toward her companion and murmured, "That was not submission." Julian heard her. His expression hardened. Eleanor rose and looked directly at him. There was no accusation in her eyes, which somehow made the moment unbearable. "May I retire, my lord?" she asked. Julian's jaw tightened. "You are not required to make a spectacle of yourself." A faint sadness touched her mouth. "I believe, sir, the spectacle was made before I arrived." Several guests lowered their eyes. Julian had no answer. Eleanor turned away before he could find one. She crossed the ballroom beneath a storm of whispers, climbed the grand staircase, and disappeared without once looking back. Only when the door of her private sitting room closed did she allow herself to breathe. Her hands trembled. She pressed them against the edge of her writing desk until the shaking stopped. 3 years of marriage had taught her Julian's habits, the slight movement of his mouth when he was angry, the silence he used when affection frightened him, the way he stared through windows whenever his conscience became inconvenient. She had loved him quietly, patiently, foolishly. Tonight, she understood something she had refused to understand before. He had not merely chosen another woman. He had chosen to make Eleanor small. A soft knock sounded. Her maid entered carrying a folded shawl, but Eleanor dismissed her with a gentle gesture. When she was alone again, She crossed to an old walnut cabinet and unlocked its lowest drawer. Inside lay a document wrapped in faded blue ribbon. Eleanor lifted it carefully. Her marriage contract. She unfolded the first page beneath the candlelight and read the clause she had never once needed to invoke. A faint, almost sorrowful smile appeared. Downstairs, the orchestra began another waltz for the woman Julian had named Duchess. Upstairs, Eleanor closed the document and whispered, "He has mistaken my silence for helplessness." She touched the ribbon once, remembering the solemn morning when she had signed her name beside his. She had entered that marriage believing patience could soften pride, and tenderness might awaken a guarded heart. Now the contract felt less like a memory than a door, quietly waiting for her hand. Somewhere below, laughter rose around Celeste. Eleanor listened, then extinguished the candle. And for the first time that night, her eyes held something other than pain. She was no longer afraid now. By morning, London had given the scandal 100 names. At breakfast tables, behind lace curtains, and beneath the awnings of fashionable shops, people repeated the story with the delighted horror reserved for another family's disgrace. The Duke of Ashbourne had presented his mistress as his wife. The Duchess had curtsied. That single detail traveled farther than any accusation could have done. Eleanor heard none of it directly. Her maid, Mrs. Finch, shielded the newspapers from her, but silence had its own language. Servants moved carefully through Ashbourne House. Footsteps softened outside Eleanor's rooms. Doors closed whenever she approached. Even the footman who poured her morning tea looked at her with an awkward tenderness that would have embarrassed her a week earlier. She remained composed. At 11, a jeweler arrived with a velvet case. The message was from Julian. Eleanor opened it in the morning room and found a sapphire necklace resting upon white satin. The stones were deep blue, almost black beneath the winter light, and large enough to have belonged to a queen. Mrs. Finch stared. "It is magnificent, Your Grace." Eleanor touched one sapphire with a gloved finger. Indeed. There was no note of affection. Only a card bearing Julian's seal and 3 words, "For Lady Celeste." Eleanor closed the case. "Send it upstairs." Mrs. Finch hesitated. "To Lady Celeste. To whomever believes she is Duchess." The maid's eyes widened, but she obeyed. By afternoon, the necklace had become public knowledge. Celeste wore it that evening at a private supper, deliberately allowing the diamonds at her ears and sapphires at her throat to announce what Julian had refused to explain. Guests praised her beauty, yet every compliment carried an invisible question. Why had Eleanor not left? That question troubled Julian more than gossip did. He found her in the library after sunset, seated beside the fire with a book open upon her lap. She wore a dove-grey gown, severe and elegant, and her hair was pinned without ornament. "You sent the necklace to Celeste," he said. Eleanor turned a page. "It was not mine. You could have caused a scene. I had already been given one." His eyes narrowed. "You seem determined to make me appear cruel." Eleanor looked up. "I need not make you appear anything, Julian." The fire cracked between them. For several seconds neither spoke. He had expected anger. Instead, her calm forced him to confront the ugliness of his own behavior without the convenient shelter of an argument. "You intend to remain here," he said at last. "Yes." "As Duchess?" Eleanor closed the book. "As your wife, until you decide otherwise. As Duchess, until the law decides otherwise." His expression changed almost imperceptibly. "What law?" "The law that existed before your temper." Julian stepped closer. "You are challenging me." "No. I am refusing to pretend." Her voice remained gentle, but something within it had strengthened. "I will not fight Lady Celeste for a place she cannot possess merely because you have announced that she may." Julian's face hardened. "You know nothing of what exists between us." "I know enough." "Then perhaps you know why I chose her." Eleanor's eyes briefly betrayed the wound she had hidden since the ballroom. "No," she whispered. "I know only that you chose to tell the world before you ever had the courage to tell me." The words struck him silent. He turned toward the window. Outside, rain slid down the glass in trembling silver lines. "I believed you never loved me," he said. Eleanor's breath caught. It was the first honest sentence he had spoken to her in years. Before she could answer, he walked away. The next morning, Eleanor attended a charitable committee meeting at St. Anne's Hall, an obligation traditionally overseen by the Duchess of Ashbourne. Celeste arrived 20 minutes later, wearing the sapphire necklace. Every woman in the room stood. Eleanor did not. Neither did the elderly secretary, Mr. Bell, who remained seated behind his ledger. Celeste smiled. I believe there has been some confusion regarding my position. Mr. Bell adjusted his spectacles. There has, my lady. He opened a leather-bound register. The charitable trust recognizes Her Grace, Duchess Eleanor Ashbourne, as its lawful patroness. No announcement made at a ball can alter the charter. Color rose in Celeste's face. Julian, who had arrived behind her, heard every word. He looked toward Eleanor. She offered him no triumph, no smile, no accusation. Only the quiet dignity that had begun to frighten him. After the meeting, Julian followed her into the corridor. You knew this would happen. I knew the truth would remain true whether you respected it or not. Why did you not tell me? Eleanor stopped beneath a tall stained-glass window. Because, Julian, I thought my husband would know his own wife. His expression faltered. She walked away before he could answer. That afternoon, London received a new rumor. An anonymous society column described Eleanor as the silent duchess who possesses neither diamonds nor bitterness, yet somehow commands more respect than the woman wearing both. Julian read the article twice. Celeste read it once and tore the page in half. But Eleanor, alone in her room, did not smile. A sealed letter had arrived for her from an elderly solicitor connected to her father's family. She broke the wax. Inside was a single sentence. Your Grace, I was present at your wedding, and I have remained silent for 3 years. I believe the time has come to tell you why. Eleanor read it again. Then she looked toward the darkening window. For the first time since Julian had humiliated her, her composure finally cracked, not from fear, but from recognition. Someone knew a secret about her marriage. And after 3 years of silence, that secret was coming home. She folded the letter against her heart, then forced herself to breathe. Whatever waited inside that history, she knew this. Julian had not told her everything about the day he placed a ring upon her finger. The solicitor's letter kept Eleanor awake until dawn. She read it beneath the weak silver of a dying candle, each sentence seeming to loosen another thread from the life she had accepted as truth. Sir Edmund Vale had witnessed her wedding. He had served Julian's father for decades. Now, after 3 years of silence, he wished to speak. At 8 o'clock, Eleanor ordered her carriage. She traveled alone through streets washed clean by overnight rain, watching London emerge beneath a pale winter sky. Yet the familiar city seemed distant. Her thoughts remained fixed upon one question. What had happened on the morning she became Duchess of Ashbourne? Sir Edmund lived in a quiet townhouse far from Mayfair's glitter. He was 70, silver-haired, and thin enough to appear fragile, but his eyes remained remarkably sharp. You have come, he said. You summoned me. I did. He led her into a study lined with old ledgers. A coal fire burned low behind an iron screen. Eleanor removed her gloves. Tell me the truth. Sir Edmund studied her. Your Grace, your marriage was not arranged for the reason you were told. Her expression remained composed, though her fingers tightened around the gloves. You were told that the Duke required a respectable alliance after his father's death, Edmund continued. That was only part of it. He opened a drawer and removed a packet tied with faded blue ribbon. Your late father-in-law chose you because he trusted your character. He believed his son possessed wealth, title, and intelligence, but lacked judgment where affection was concerned. Eleanor frowned. What has that to do with me? Everything. Edmund placed the packet before her. Before your marriage, the Duke intended to marry Lady Celeste Vane. Eleanor felt the old wound open. I know. No, Edmund said quietly. You know that they were acquainted. You do not know why the engagement ended. He unfolded several letters. Celeste had been corresponding with men connected to a rival political faction. The letters suggested that she had sought information concerning Ashbourne finances and charitable trusts. Julian's father discovered the correspondence before the engagement became official. He believed she desired the Ashbourne name more than the man wearing it, Edmund said. Eleanor stared at the pages. Then why did Julian not tell me? Because his father forbade him to discuss the matter until the estate was secure. And Julian obeyed. He obeyed his father in public. In private, he resented him. That explained more than Eleanor wanted. Julian had never spoken of his father without bitterness. Perhaps he had entered their marriage believing Eleanor was another command imposed upon him. Sir Edmund continued. Your father-in-law also created a safeguard. He showed her a clause in the marriage settlement. Eleanor read it slowly. Certain charitable trusts and estates remained under the legal authority of the Duchess, independent of the Duke's personal declarations. She looked up. So he anticipated this. He anticipated that his son might one day confuse power with wisdom. Eleanor returned to Ashbourne House before dusk. Julian was waiting in the library. "You went to see Vale?" "Yes." "What did he tell you?" "That my marriage was built upon secrets." Julian looked away. Eleanor approached him. "Did you love Celeste?" He hesitated. "Once, I believed I did. And now? I do not know." She absorbed the answer without flinching. "That is the first honest uncertainty you have ever given me." Julian's eyes lifted to hers. "Why did you curtsy to her?" Eleanor's gaze softened. "Because I would not allow your cruelty to choose my behavior. You made me look like a fool." "No, Julian. Your actions did that." He winced. She continued quietly. "I could have screamed. I could have struck her. I could have humiliated you before everyone who watched. But then your cruelty would have entered me, and I would have carried it wherever I went." Julian stepped closer. "I thought you never loved me." Her composure finally faltered. "I loved you so much that I learned to hide it." Silence filled the library. Julian looked at her as though seeing her for the first time. "Why did you never tell me?" "Because every time I reached for you, you became colder." His face tightened with regret. "I believed your silence meant indifference." "It meant fear." He lowered his eyes. Yet beneath his regret, Eleanor sensed another emotion, darker and more uncertain: fear. Not fear of losing Celeste, but fear of discovering that the woman he had dismissed as quiet had understood the foundations of his life better than he ever had. That realization frightened him because it left him nowhere to hide. Behind all his pride, Eleanor saw the young man she had married beneath the Duke's polished severity. Julian saw the woman whose quiet devotion had been standing beside him while he searched elsewhere for admiration. Then he whispered, "Celeste wants to be Duchess. She already believes she is. She has arranged a ceremony." Eleanor's expression changed. "When?" "3 days from now. She intends to be formally recognized before half the aristocracy." Eleanor looked into the fire. "Then let her." Julian stared. "You would allow it?" "I would allow her to reveal herself." "Eleanor, what are you planning?" She turned toward him, calm once more. "Nothing." "Nothing?" "Truth requires less effort than deception. Give it enough room, and it will eventually speak." Julian studied her, unsettled by the certainty in her voice. "You wanted society to believe she was your Duchess." She looked back at him. "Very well. Let society watch carefully." 3 days later, every invitation in London carried the same promise: a grand Ashbourne ceremony, where Lady Celeste Vane would finally receive public recognition as Duchess. Julian no longer did. And Eleanor, standing alone before her mirror that night, fastened a single emerald at her throat and remembered the solicitor's final warning. "Your Grace, when the truth becomes public, someone will lose far more than a title." Eleanor looked at her reflection. For the first time, she wondered whether the secret waiting behind that ceremony would destroy her marriage, or finally reveal what her husband had never dared confess. 3 days later, Ashbourne House blazed with candlelight. The ancestral hall had been transformed for the ceremony. Hundreds of candles burned beneath carved oak beams, their flames trembling in the winter draught. Garlands of white roses climbed the columns, and musicians waited beside the gallery while aristocrats gathered beneath glittering chandeliers. Everyone had come to witness Celeste Vane become Duchess. Eleanor stood in a small chamber above the hall, fastening an emerald brooch at her throat. Her gown was deep green silk, modestly cut, its sleeves embroidered with antique vines. She looked into the mirror and saw neither a defeated wife nor a jealous rival. She saw a woman who had finally stopped asking permission to possess her own dignity. A knock sounded. Julian entered. For a moment, neither spoke. He wore formal black, but there was no triumph in his face. His eyes rested on Eleanor with an uncertainty she had never seen there before. "You need not attend," he said. "I know." "Then why will you?" "Because I refuse to disappear merely because you find my presence inconvenient." His gaze lowered. "I deserve that." "You deserve more than words." He absorbed the rebuke without protest. "I have spent 3 days thinking about what you told me." "And?" "I was wrong." Eleanor's expression barely changed. "About what?" "About you." The simplicity of the admission struck deeper than an elaborate apology could have. Julian stepped closer. "I thought you were cold because you did not love me. I thought your silence was judgment. I thought Celeste understood me because she admired the man everyone else feared. And now I think I mistook admiration for love." Eleanor looked away. "You cannot repair 3 years in 3 days." "No," he said. "But I can stop making them worse." A bell sounded below. The ceremony was beginning. Celeste entered the hall wearing ivory silk embroidered with pearls. The sapphire necklace gleamed against her throat. She moved with magnificent confidence, accepting greetings as though the title already belonged to her. Julian followed. Eleanor remained upstairs. The master of ceremonies raised his staff. "My lords and ladies, we gather to recognize." "Stop." Julian's voice cut through the hall. Every face turned. Celeste stared at him. He walked to the center of the room, then looked toward the staircase. Eleanor descended slowly. Julian waited until she reached the final step. Then he bowed his head. "Your Grace." A shock passed through the room. Celeste's face drained of color. Julian turned toward the assembled aristocracy. 3 nights ago, I publicly presented Lady Celeste Vane as Duchess of Ashbourne. I had no right to do so. No one moved. I humiliated my wife because I lacked the courage to confront my own unhappiness honestly. I mistook pride for strength and cruelty for freedom. Eleanor watched him carefully. He continued. "The Duchess of Ashbourne has never ceased to be my wife, and no announcement of mine could change that." Celeste stepped forward. "Julian, you promised me." He looked at her with sadness rather than anger. "I promised you what I had no right to promise." Her composure shattered. "You would discard me before everyone?" "No," Eleanor said. Every eye shifted toward her. Celeste stared. Eleanor approached with measured steps. "I will not have another woman destroyed merely because my husband behaved dishonorably." Julian looked at her, astonished. Eleanor continued. "Lady Celeste made choices. So did Julian. But neither justice nor dignity requires me to become cruel because I have been wounded." A murmur passed through the crowd. Then the great doors opened. Sir Edmund Vale entered carrying a leather case. Celeste went rigid. Julian turned. Edmund approached the Duke and bowed. "Your Grace, I believe you should see these before this evening concludes." He opened the case. Inside lay copies of letters written by Celeste months before Julian's declaration. They revealed her inquiries into Ashbourne charitable trusts, financial holdings, and influential committees. She had not merely sought the title. She had intended to use it. Julian read the first page. Then another. His face hardened. Celeste whispered, "Those letters were private." Edmund answered quietly, "So was the marriage you attempted to replace." The room erupted in whispers. Celeste looked toward Eleanor, expecting triumph. She found none. Eleanor simply stood beneath the chandeliers, her hands folded before her, refusing the satisfaction of another woman's ruin. For the first time, Julian understood why Eleanor's curtsy had unsettled the entire ballroom. She had not bowed to Celeste. She had bowed to herself, refusing to let humiliation dictate the shape of her soul. That realization cut deeper than any accusation. He remembered every morning she had waited for his attention, every evening she had hidden disappointment behind courtesy, every kindness he had accepted without asking what it cost her. He wanted to reach for her, but restrained himself. The restraint was new. It was the first evidence that his love might finally be becoming something other than possession. Eleanor noticed. She did not smile, but the guardedness in her eyes softened by one precious degree. For Julian, that small mercy was everything. Julian approached her after the guests had fallen silent. "I do not ask you to forgive me tonight." "Good. I only ask for the chance to become worthy of forgiveness." Eleanor studied the man before her. 4 years, she had loved him from behind a wall he never noticed. Tonight, for the first time, he had removed his own armor. "That chance," she said softly, "will not be granted by a title." "I know. It will be earned in private." "I know." She offered him her hand. Not as surrender. Not as absolution. As a beginning. Julian took it carefully. Across the hall, the broken sapphire necklace lay forgotten upon a velvet chair. And beneath the golden candlelight, society witnessed something far more startling than a woman losing a title. It witnessed a duke finally learning that love could not be commanded, displayed, or inherited. It had to be deserved. By spring, the scandal had become history, but Eleanor understood that history could still live inside a house. Ashbourne House was quieter now. Servants no longer hesitated when she entered, and invitations arrived with her name written confidently across the envelopes. Yet Eleanor had learned that public restoration was easier than private healing. Julian had changed. He no longer appeared at breakfast because duty required it. He asked what she intended for the day. He listened when she spoke about the charitable trusts. He stopped interrupting her decisions and began consulting her before making his own. The gestures were small, but Eleanor noticed every one. He was learning that repentance was not a speech. It was repetition. One rainy afternoon, Eleanor found him in the music room, where dust had once covered the piano she loved. He stood beside the window holding a bundle of old sheet music. "I had these restored," he said. She touched the pages. "You remembered." "I remember more than I deserve credit for." A faint smile touched her lips. "That is a dangerous improvement." He smiled too. For a moment, the distance between them vanished. Then Julian's expression became serious. "Eleanor, there is something I must say." She waited. "I cannot undo the night I humiliated you. I cannot erase the words I spoke or make London forget them. No. But I can spend the rest of my life making certain that no one doubts your place beside me." Eleanor lowered her eyes. "My place beside you must never depend upon society again." "I know." "Do you?" He stepped closer. "I do now." That answer mattered because he did not try to charm her. Weeks later, Ashbourne House hosted its first large gathering since the scandal. Guests entered with cautious smiles, curious to discover whether the marriage had survived. Eleanor descended the staircase wearing ivory silk embroidered with delicate gold leaves. Pearls rested at her ears, and her chestnut hair was gathered into a graceful chignon. Julian waited below. When she reached him, he offered his arm. Not as a command. As an invitation. She accepted. The orchestra played. They danced. There was no declaration, only the quiet miracle of two people moving together without pretending the past had never happened. Later, Julian led her onto the terrace. The gardens were silver beneath the moon. "Do you remember the first night?" he asked. "How could I forget?" "I remember your curtsy." "So does everyone." "I remember thinking you had surrendered." Eleanor looked toward the gardens. "And now?" "Now I understand that you were the strongest person in that room." Her eyes softened. "You were cruel." "Yes." "You were proud." "Yes." "You were frightened." Julian breathed slowly. "Yes." She turned toward him. "Of what?" "Of loving someone who could see through me." The confession silenced her. Julian continued. "You saw my weakness and never used it. You saw my loneliness and never mocked it. I rewarded that loyalty by making you believe you were unwanted." Eleanor's eyes glistened. "I was never unwanted," she whispered. "I was simply unloved in the way I deserved." Julian closed his eyes briefly. "That is what I am trying to change." She reached for his hand. This time, he did not seize it. He waited. She placed her fingers in his. The gesture meant everything. Then a servant appeared at the terrace doors carrying a sealed envelope. "For Her Grace." Eleanor recognized the handwriting immediately. Sir Edmund Vale. Her smile faded as she broke it. The letter contained only a few lines. The truth about Celeste had been exposed, but Edmund had discovered another document among the late Duke's papers. It concerned the night Eleanor and Julian had married and contained a private confession Julian's father had never intended his son to read. Eleanor looked up. Julian noticed the change in her face. "What is it?" She handed him the letter. He read it once. Then again. His expression turned pale. "What does it say?" Eleanor asked. Julian folded the page carefully. "It says my father knew I loved you before I did." Eleanor stared. "That is impossible." "He wrote that he watched me choose you, even while I pretended the marriage was an obligation." Her breath caught. Julian looked at her with tears standing dangerously close to his eyes. "He believed I would destroy what I loved because I was too proud to need it." Eleanor felt something inside her break open, not painfully, but like a locked window finally yielding to spring. "Your father understood you better than you understood yourself." "Yes. And he trusted me. More than I did." Julian took her hands. "I cannot promise that I will never fail you. I would distrust such a promise." He smiled through the sadness. "But I can promise that when I fail, I will tell you the truth before anyone else does." Eleanor studied his face. Then she leaned forward and rested her forehead against his. It was not a grand reconciliation. It was better. It was chosen. Years later, London would still tell the story of the Duke who once presented his mistress as Duchess. But whenever Eleanor heard it, she remembered. She remembered the ballroom, the silence, the sapphire necklace, the humiliation, and the curtsy. Society had believed that gesture meant defeat. They had been wrong. Eleanor had bowed only to preserve her dignity. She rose because she knew her worth. And in the end, the Duke learned the lesson that titles could never teach him. A woman does not become smaller because someone refuses to honor her. Love is not possession. Marriage is not permission. And dignity, once understood, cannot be taken by another person's cruelty. When the final waltz ended that evening, Julian offered Eleanor his arm. She accepted it. Not because she needed him to make her whole, but because he had learned to walk beside a woman already complete. Years later, London still remembered the night the Duke presented another woman as Duchess. But society remembered something even more clearly, the quiet curtsy of Eleanor Ashbourne. They had mistaken her silence for weakness. They had mistaken her composure for surrender. But Eleanor knew a truth that her husband had taken years to understand. A person's worth does not decrease simply because someone refuses to recognize it. She could have answered cruelty with cruelty. She could have destroyed Celeste, humiliated Julian, and allowed bitterness to become the rest of her life. Instead, she chose dignity. And Julian learned the hardest lesson of all: love is not possession, marriage is not power, and a title means nothing if the person wearing it has forgotten how to honor the heart beside them. Eleanor did not need revenge to reclaim her place. She only needed to remember who she was. So if this story touched your heart, remember Eleanor's lesson. Never let someone else's disrespect become the measure of your own worth. Stand with dignity, speak your truth, and never be ashamed of choosing yourself. If you enjoyed this Victorian tale of betrayal, dignity, and unexpected love, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, and follow for more unforgettable historical romance stories. And tell us in the comments, would you have forgiven the Duke, or would you have walked away forever?